So we are going to be making some French macarons. It is pronounced macaron, not macaroon. Macaroons are a totally different thing that have coconut in them. These are the classic French sandwich cookies that are based on a meringue, and they always have some kind of nut flour folded into them. So a lot of people are very intimidated to make these cookies because they definitely can be very finicky. But we're going to give you some great techniques to hopefully ensure that we get a wonderful cookie outcome. So first of all, we need to start with our egg whites. So we like to weigh our egg whites as opposed to measuring them or just counting them, because sometimes, I don't know how we can see in the video, but sometimes we can wind up with an egg that's this big, sometimes we can wind up with an egg that's this big. So we never know how much we're going to get just by always saying, oh, we need 4 egg whites. So what you can do is you can measure out 4 to 5 egg whites, and then we can weigh them out. 1 egg white should weigh roughly 1 ounce, maybe 1.1. But if you count 4 ounces, you should be just about fine. And you can actually weigh or measure eggs. So if you have a volume measuring cup that has the ounces up the side, you can also do it that way if you don't have a scale. So we always like to show people how to separate our eggs. What I like to do is one smack on a flat surface, press them with the sides of my finger quickly and pull out. It is much easier to separate our eggs when they're cold. However, it is much easier to whip them if they are warm. So we can separate them and then let them sit out for about an hour or so before we actually make our cookies. So if you saw, I just reached in with my nice clean fingers and just picked my yolk up and let my whites sit down below, and that way we don't get any yolk into our whites. If you get any yolk in your white whatsoever, they will not whip properly. So once you get 1 good egg white, put it into a separate container, and that way if you have cracked 4 eggs and then you pop 1 yolk, you've contaminated all of them. So again, once you get 1 good clean white, put that into a separate bowl, and that way we ensure that we're going to whip our egg whites properly. So another great insurance policy to make sure our egg whites whip properly is to wipe out our bowl with some kind of acid. So you can use white vinegar, or I just had a half a lemon left over from another recipe, so I'm just going to use some lemon juice instead. So just put a little bit of lemon juice, probably about a tablespoon or so, onto a clean paper towel, and then I'm just going to wipe my bowl out. So maybe the last thing that I whipped in here was heavy cream or butter. And even if you wash your bowl well, there can be traces of fat in that bowl. So again, if there's any trace of fat in there whatsoever, your egg whites will not whip properly. So just take this one extra step to ensure that you're going to get really good lift into your egg whites. And also wiping off my whip attachment, just to make sure that there was no fat left on that either. So I have my egg whites in my mixer fitted with the whip attachment, and I'm also going to add a little bit of cream of tartar. So cream of tartar is called tartaric acid. So just like the lemon juice or vinegar that we've wiped the bowl out, we also stabilize our egg whites by putting some kind of acid in there. So it does what's called denaturing the protein, so it helps to stabilize the proteins. So we always like to add a little bit of cream of tartar to the egg whites as we're whipping them to help them along. So if we start out on about medium speed, we're going to start building those bubbles. Once we see that our egg whites are pretty foamy, we're going to crank that speed up, and later on we'll add in our fine sugar. As we can see, our egg whites definitely have some lift in them, and they've turned a little bit more white in color. However, I can see when I look inside the bowl, they still look pretty yellow, but they have enough lift to the point where I'm going to crank the speed all the way up. Lots of people are afraid of the speed of their mixer. Here is where we really need it. So I'm going to crank it up to 10. And let that go until I can see soft tracks left in the egg whites. And that's when I'll know I'm ready to add my fine sugar. So you can buy this in the store called caster sugar. It is a very, very finely ground sugar. And if you can't find this, or if you don't want to go out to the store and buy a different type of sugar, you can actually just use your regular granulated sugar, throw it in the food processor, just whiz it up for a little bit, and it's going to get much finer. And honestly, if you just use regular granulated sugar, you'll be okay too. You can see we are leaving gentle tracks in the egg white, so now I'm very slowly going to rein in my fine sugar and wait until we get nice stiff peaks. I can see that my egg whites are sticking inside my whip right here, and that's usually one indication that I know I have really good stiff peaks. Now is the time when you want to add your extracts or your colorings. I do suggest using a gel cake color that you can find at a craft store. You can find it online because we don't want to add too much moisture here. I also had a big mishap one time by adding an extract that was an oil base. So that made my egg whites totally deflate. So make sure that you have an alcohol-based extract. You can also use liqueurs for this to give it a little bit more flavor. So I'm just going to whip those back in and make sure I have those really nice good stiff peaks before we start folding them into our other ingredients. So I whipped in my extracts and just let the whites continue to whip for another minute or so, just to make sure they are fully incorporated and we get that really nice, good, stiff peak. Perfect. The great thing about macarons is that they're very versatile. You can use any kind of nut flour. Now, there are not a lot of nut flours out on the market these days, but definitely almond is the classic macaron. And you can find this at just about every grocery store these days. So this is an almond flour. We also use a hazelnut one. I have made my own nut flours before. I've made a pistachio and just whiz the nuts up into a food processor and make sure they're nice and fine. Just make sure and pulse them, because if you just run them, they almost create like a nut butter that is a little bit too greasy. So, but you can use kind of just what you have in your pantry. So I have 2 cups of powdered sugar and then 1 cup of my almond meal or almond flour. And I'm sifting those both together. We want to make sure that there are no lumps whatsoever in this. And then we're actually going to fold the egg whites into the nut flour instead of the other way around. So I like to have a very big bowl for folding my macarons, and also a nice big rubber spatula because it makes this job much easier. So I'm going to get a nice dollop, probably about 1/3 of my egg whites, into my nut mixture. And I like to think of my bowl as a clock. So I start at 12 o'clock, go underneath all the ingredients to 6, fold over, and then pull back with the back of my spatula. Quarter turn of the bowl. 12 to 6 underneath, pull back, quarter turn. 12 to 6 underneath, pull back. So this is not like making a souffle where we're not trying to deflate the air. We are actually trying to deflate most of it, or else we would wind up with a sandwich cookie that was so big it wouldn't fit inside our mouths. This is my second addition of egg whites, and I want to stop at the point where we're not quite fully incorporated, because if we don't stop there, we're going to deflate too much of the egg whites before we add that next addition. So here's my last addition of whites. Make sure we really scrape our mixer bowl where we have whipped our egg whites. So there's a point when we start looking a little bit shiny right here. So we still look a little bit grainy over here, and then it starts to get shiny here. So we still want about 4 or 5 more turns of our rubber spatula, but we want to make sure that we stop before it looks completely shiny, or else we'll wind up with very flat macarons. I'm going to fill my piping bag up. So I always say, like trying to get down to the toe of a long pair of nylons, hold underneath and fold over. And we're going to hold underneath like an ice cream cone. We do not want to fill this bag super full, because by the time you get to the end of your batter, it'll start getting very runny, and then that's when you get either flat or cracked macarons. So I'm just going to put about a cup or so of my batter into my bag. And then I'll show you how to pipe, but before I do that, I just want to talk to you a little bit about my pan. So I have a very flat sheet pan here, and I'm actually piping these out onto the back of my sheet pan. I make a template out of parchment paper, just little circles, and I just use a little ring cutter as my guide. Just use a Sharpie for that, and I always keep that around. And then I put a silicone mat on top of that, and that way when I pipe all my macarons out onto my sheet pan, then I can just slide that template out from beneath and use it for another pan. So no tip needed to make our macarons. I'm just going to snip a little bit of the bag, and when we're not actually piping, hold your piping bag, the open end up, to make sure that the batter doesn't fall out. So I'm going to hold my piping bag perpendicular to my sheet pan. I'm not icing a cupcake here. I'm holding the tip right in the center of my circle, squeezing until I fill up my circle, and then lifting up and going quickly to the next circle. So depending on the stiffness of your macaron batter, sometimes we can wind up with these little peaks here. So all we need to do there is just dip your finger in a little bit of water and just tamp them down with your damp finger. Easy as that. Sometimes we can develop some bubbles on the inside of our macarons, so we need to get the bubbles out. So I like to drop it like it's hot. Take it from way up here, about a foot above the surface, and just drop it. Don't be afraid. One more time. All right. There are lots of different schools of thought on letting your macarons rest before you bake them. Today is kind of a gloomy, gray day out, and macarons are very subject to humidity in the air. So I am going to give myself a little extra insurance by letting this batter rest on my sheet pan for about 30 to 40 minutes before I bake them. And we've done this in class where by the time we get to the last batch that goes into the oven, they have rested already for about 30 minutes, but I haven't noticed a super difference between resting and not resting, so it really depends on what you want to do at home. No matter what, they're still going to taste great. Macarons have been in the oven at 310 for about 17 minutes. They're nice and shiny on the top. This little frill down at the bottom is called the pied, or the foot, which is the sign of a good macaron. So it looks today like we bested the macaron. So the macarons have been cooling. I let them cool on the sheet pan because that helps them be able to come off of the pan a little bit easier. And what I always like to show people is that you don't want to pick the macaron up off of the sheet pan like this, because see how it's sticking to the pan and you can wind up cracking your macaron. So what you can do instead is pick the silicone mat or parchment paper up and peel the paper off of the cookie. So I almost tip it over upside down and push against it very gently, and then the cookie comes off in one piece. Another way that this cookie is very versatile is that you can fill it with just about anything. Lots of times people will fill it with buttercream, but you can fill it with a jam. I have a little bit of cherry sauce that we made for a cheesecake. So we can just put that on one side of one cookie and then top it with another cookie. We don't really want our filling too full because then it makes the cookie a little bit harder to eat. One of the easiest things that you can put in as a filling is, this is kind of the Whole Foods version of a chocolate hazelnut spread. It's called No Chocolata. Has a beautiful flavor. It is so delicious. But you could use nut butters. You can use any kind of jam or jelly. We've actually done a kind of an Almond Joy inspired macaron where we put an almond in the center and then we mixed some icing with some coconut. That is one of my favorite ones of all time. So there it is, your wonderful macaron. And just to show you, when you have a fresh macaron, what happens is you get a nice crispy outside and then, ooh, look at that, so chewy and delicious on the inside. You will never have a better macaron in any shop than your own home kitchen.